in Syria. That's according to the CNN news channel, citing its sources in Washington, who say that defeating the Islamists is impossible while President Assad stays in power. But as RT's Maria Finoshina reports next, toppling the Syrian leader may always have been America's real goal anyway.
Since the beginning of the Syrian crisis, Washington and some other countries, Western and Arab countries, have been blaming the Syrian leadership for militarizing what they considered a peaceful, democratic public uprising and letting it go that far. They have been supporting the so-called Syrian opposition, financing and arming them. It is now a matter of fact that many members of the so-called moderate Syrian opposition ended up joining ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra and other religious extremist groups battling Assad here in Syria. Earlier in September, just to remind you, the US declared a war against the jihadists and started multi-billion bombing campaign targeting different sites here in Syria and Iraq. But even before it started, we heard criticism, including from Obama's own advisors and from other analysts, that this strategy is not realistic. And we also heard an opinion that Washington just wants to remove President Bashar al-Assad, and by this strategy it tries to cover the ultimate goal and the true mission.
Hi, nice to see you at last here. Now, Syria's been siding with the aims of the US-led anti-Islamic State coalition, as I was saying. If this is true, these reports from CNN, they're not substantiated from anyone else yet. How might Damascus react to this latest development and say, if it is true, could this have been a plan that was actually behind the scenes in the offing all along?
Well, there hasn't been any formal response from Damascus regarding the latest developments, but Damascus has always said that it wants more coordination with the coalition airstrikes. It wants more cooperation with the Americans in terms of fighting the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. So I think if the Americans show any sincere intentions towards the Syrians, I think the Syrians would jump on that train and actually work with the Americans in this particular issue.
Mind you, the United States National Security Council has called Assad here, quote, the biggest magnet for extremism in Syria. Of course, even though, as you're saying, that Damascus has repeated their help come on board with America and tackle ISIS. Where's America getting this from, that they're a magnet for extremism, that Assad and the team are a magnet for extremism, because they want to fight ISIS?
Well, in a way, they're trying to characterize the situation where they believe that the regime's response to the situation in the country, the protests, has created a turbulence across the country, instability, the instability that created an environment, according to the Americans we're speaking here, a suitable environment for the extremist Islamist groups like ISIL, al-Nusra Front and Ahrar al-Sham and many other radical Islamic groups that we're seeing operating on the ground here. Many here in Damascus would contradict this view and say the reason Syria has become such a big magnet for extremists is because the flow of weapons and money coming in from many countries that has decided that they want to overthrow President Bashar al-Assad at any cost, including arming rebels, including funding them, including creating radical organizations, all with the hope that the government in Syria would fall down within months and then they will deal with the issues created by the funding and the arming. But somehow this did not work out. The government managed to stay in place and the fighting went on and on. So we're seeing the repercussions of the early on arming and financing of these armed groups. We're seeing it right now. Let's bear in mind that many of the groups that has long been considered part of the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, which is considered a moderate rebel umbrella group, many of these groups are now pledging allegiance to ISIL. Such just yesterday, Al-Farouq Battalion is one of the most famous or most well-known factions of the FSA, has pledged allegiance to ISIL in Al-Qalamoun area on the Syrian-Lebanese borders.
So do you think, you're just saying that, yeah, the Assad government has hung in throughout it all, throughout everything that's happened over the last couple of years. Do you think we're going to see another pronged attack then coming from America to try to oust him yet again then? And that really this was behind the scenes all along?
Well, the Americans have been very uncertain about their strategy in Syria and in Syria in general and in Syria regarding fighting ISIL since, let's say, August this year when ISIL took over Mosul and then posed a threat on Kurdistan, Iraq. It's very hard to predict what the next American move will be. Many thought that when the chemical attack took place in Syria in August last year, the Americans would step in and bombard the government. Then at least a year later, we're seeing the American administration bombarding the enemies of the current Syrian government. So it's a very complicated situation. The Americans did not show any coherent policy in Syria, aside from saying publicly that they want to overthrow the government of President Bashar al-Assad and that they will not do anything that will help him sustain his position. But aside from this, they haven't done, they didn't come up with any coherent policy to deal with the situation, either in Syria or with the situation regarding ISIL and its spread in Iraq and Syria.
Alaa Ibrahim, journalist and political analyst in Damascus there. Thanks for your thoughts.